The man historically known as Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII of England, was born within the walls of Pembroke Castle in the western region of Wales on the 28th of January in the year 1457. Edmund Tudor, the first Earl of Richmond, was Henry's father. He was the offspring of Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, whom Catherine had wed following the passing of her first husband, King Henry VII, back in 1422. This familial connection positioned Edmund Tudor, Henry's paternal parent, as a half-brother to the then-reigning English king, Henry VII. Henry's mother was Lady Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, the third son of King Edward III, who had governed England between 1327 and 1377, and Catherine Swynford. Henry's early years were fraught with peril, a characteristic that would define the initial 3 decades of his existence. His father, Edmund Tudor, succumbed to bubonic plague just 3 months before Henry's birth. Following this tragedy, his mother, Margaret, merely 13 years old at the time, sought safety at Pembroke Castle with her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, who would assume a paternal role for his infant nephew. Margaret, being frail, small in stature, and far too youthful for childbirth, endured such extreme difficulties during her labor that her attendants anticipated the death of both her and her child. Yet Henry survived and Margaret recovered, though it is probable that giving birth at such a tender age resulted in physical complications, as Margaret, despite 2 subsequent marriages throughout her life, bore no more children. Her only son, Henry, became the focal point of Margaret's existence. He felt her fierce love and protection, and she nurtured grand aspirations for his future. Margaret had been pledged in marriage to Edmund Tudor at the age of 9, 3 years prior to her wedding when she was just 12. At the time of this betrothal, King Henry VI, England's current monarch, lacked an heir, although a son, Edward of Westminster, would be born to him and his queen, Margaret of Anjou, in 1453. As the wealthiest female inheritor in England, commanding an annual income of £1,000, Margaret also possessed royal lineage, being the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the 3rd son of the last undisputed Plantagenet king, Edward III. In contrast, the rival House of York comprised royal figures descended from the 2nd and 4th sons of Edward III, which illuminates why the initial confrontations of the Wars of the Roses were, in some circles, termed the Cousins' War. This lineage might have ostensibly placed Henry in line for the throne at his birth. However, Margaret Beaufort's family traced its descent from John of Gaunt's 3rd marriage to Catherine Swynford, who had served as the Duke's mistress for a quarter-century, and whose children had all been born before their marital union, granting them royal blood but deeming them illegitimate. A royal decree issued decades earlier by King Henry IV had subsequently legitimized the Beaufort children but had explicitly stipulated that neither they nor their heirs could inherit the English throne. Consequently, the Yorkists possessed a considerably stronger claim to the English throne should Henry VI ever be removed from power, while Henry Tudor's claim was tenuous due to the illegitimacy associated with the descendants of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. Nevertheless, the Tudors enjoyed favorable circumstances under Henry VI, with the king and his administration bestowing titles upon Edmund and Jasper Tudor, who were Henry VI's half-brothers by virtue of being the sons of the Dowager Queen Catherine of Valois from her 2nd marriage to Owen Tudor. Few specific details are known regarding Henry's upbringing and education. As a member of the Royal House of Lancaster, he would have received a quality education, one that was then beginning to exhibit influences of the humanistic curriculum being developed in Renaissance Italy, with its focus on grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, history, languages, and geography. His guardianship and place of residence underwent several changes throughout his childhood and adolescence, often without significant advance notice. The deep and enduring connection between Henry and his mother would remain strong, but regrettably they were separated before Henry reached his first birthday. In the spring of 1457, Margaret remained with her infant son and brother-in-law, Jasper, at Pembroke Castle, mourning her deceased husband who had passed away just months prior to Henry's arrival. However, recognizing the necessity of protecting him, she understood she must remarry. This posed no significant difficulty for Margaret, given her status as a wealthy heiress. By April, the now 14-year-old Margaret Beaufort was betrothed to Henry Stafford, the 2nd son of the Duke of Buckingham, who was 15 years her senior. They married in January 1458. By all accounts, Margaret's 2nd marriage was a contented one. Henry was entrusted to the care of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, at Pembroke Castle, an arrangement less harsh than it might appear. All evidence indicates that Jasper held a deep affection for his nephew. Like the majority of individuals in England during this period, Henry's life was inextricably linked to the fluctuating fortunes of the Wars of the Roses. Each shift in power brought sudden alterations to his standing, his security, and his daily existence. King Henry VI had acceded to the English and French thrones back in 1422 when he was merely 9 months old, due to the untimely death of his father, King Henry V. At that juncture, England occupied a strong position, having achieved a momentous victory over the French at the Battle of Agincourt just a few years prior as part of the 100 Years' War. However, Henry VI's reign was marked by a dramatic decline in England's circumstances, with the king's regency fostering internal strife among the English nobles who competed for influence over the child king. To exacerbate matters as Henry VI approached adulthood, he began to suffer from recurring mental health issues, frequently falling into periods of dementia-like confusion and at times exhibiting near catatonic behavior. The king's fragile health and prolonged periods of unresponsiveness led to a breakdown in governance and authority, creating an opportunity for a power vacuum to emerge. Authority now resided with those in closest proximity to this weakened king, and the Yorkists would develop resentment towards what they perceived as the corrupt exploitation of Henry's vulnerable condition by his Lancastrian ministers and advisors. They would also attribute the steady losses of Henry VI's territorial gains in France to the Lancastrians and harbored suspicion towards Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, a Frenchwoman whom they resented for assuming an intensely active role in governmental and military affairs on her husband's behalf. Concurrently, the Lancastrians actively endeavored to prevent the Yorkists, their Plantagenet cousins, from reaching for the throne themselves. Tensions between those surrounding the king escalated throughout the 1450s, erupting into violent conflict by the spring of 1450. Over the ensuing 5 years, hostilities would continue to intensify, culminating in the Yorkists being accused of treason, leaving them with little recourse but to fight to seize the throne. The leader of the Yorkist faction, Richard, Duke of York, had proclaimed his claim to the crown and initiated a civil war to assert that claim from the mid-1450s onwards. When he died at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460, his eldest surviving son and heir, the 18-year-old Edward, assumed his father's claim and cause, ultimately securing a decisive triumph against the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton in North Yorkshire on the 20th of March 1461, which represented one of the most exceptionally bloody conflicts in terms of lives lost ever fought on English soil. Approximately 50,000 troops were engaged at the zenith of the 12-hour battle, and over 15,000 were either killed or wounded. On the 28th of June 1461, Edward of York was crowned King Edward IV at Westminster Abbey, and Henry Tudor's life underwent a permanent transformation. The initial years of the new king's reign saw him strive to solidify his rule by removing or diminishing the power of other claimants to the English throne. Henry VI was captured by the new king, but his wife, Queen Margaret, sought refuge in France with her young son, Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. Meanwhile, 4-year-old Henry Tudor was deprived of his estates and the title Earl of Richmond, which earldom King Edward IV subsequently bestowed upon his own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Henry's uncle Jasper, a steadfast Lancastrian general whose life was now imperiled, bade a brief and poignant farewell to his nephew before departing into exile in France. Subsequently, King Edward IV granted both Jasper Tudor's earldom of Pembroke and the guardianship of Henry Tudor to the loyal Yorkist supporter, Sir William Herbert. Henry would remain at Pembroke under Herbert's care for the next 8 years, essentially held as a prisoner by the Yorkists. While Henry's circumstances had altered significantly, he was likely too young to fully grasp the implications of what was occurring. Edward IV had appointed a Yorkist guardian to oversee him, ensuring he did not develop any aspirations regarding his own claim to the throne, however weak it might be. Although the boy was technically incarcerated, there is no evidence to suggest that Sir William Herbert subjected Henry to mistreatment. Instead, he continued to reside in the home he was familiar with and received regular, albeit closely monitored, visits from his mother and stepfather. Henry's life experienced another sudden shift in 1469 when Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, famously known as the Kingmaker for his instrumental role in orchestrating Edward IV's ascent to the throne, rebelled against the man he had helped guide to power. Warwick now sought to depose Edward and install his younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, on the throne. Clarence himself had already commenced efforts to clear his own path to the throne by resurrecting old rumors suggesting the new king had been secretly married to another woman prior to his union with his queen, Elizabeth Woodville, which would render their marriage illegal and all their children illegitimate. In the ensuing conflict, Sir William Herbert fought loyally for King Edward as a staunch Yorkist, but following their defeat at the Battle of Edgecote Moor in July 1469, Herbert was captured by Warwick, denounced as an evil advisor to the king, and executed. With his guardian deceased, the 12-year-old Henry sought sanctuary with his mother and stepfather at their estate located at Woking. In the aftermath of the brief restoration of Henry VI and the swift return of Edward IV to power, the majority of Lancastrians fled England, convinced that Edward would now eliminate them if they remained within the country. Fearful that Henry's life was in danger, Margaret Beaufort arranged for her 14-year-old son to depart the country as well. Following the defeat at Tewkesbury, Jasper Tudor collected his nephew and the two boarded a vessel at Tenby in Pembrokeshire, setting sail for Brittany in northwestern France and embarking on a period of exile. They would reside in France for the next 14 years. Henry's mother did not join them there, however. Her third husband, Henry Stafford, had been killed at the Battle of Barnet, and a year later, in 1472, Margaret married again, this time to the Yorkist Lord Thomas Stanley. Some historians propose that this marriage was a political maneuver, that Margaret viewed the union as a means of remaining safely close to the Yorkist court of King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Through this arrangement, with Henry securely situated in Brittany, she would be able to monitor the political situation in England and advance her son's interests there. In France, Henry and Jasper traveled to the city of Nantes to seek refuge at the court of Francis II, the Duke of Brittany. The Duke extended a courteous welcome to the two as his guests, and they accompanied the court on their journey to Vannes the following year. However, Duke Francis found himself in a precarious position, having pledged his word to shelter, protect, and provide for his guests, yet two considerably more powerful individuals than he were also demonstrating a keen interest in the fate of Henry and Jasper Tudor. From England, King Edward IV persistently demanded that Francis extradite them back to England. Edward's objective was undoubtedly to eliminate the last remaining living Lancastrian claimant to the throne. Now that Henry VI was deceased and his son, Edward of Westminster, had also been killed following Edward's triumph at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Duke Francis also had to take into account the desires of King Louis XVIII of France, who was Jasper's first cousin and Henry's second cousin, and who also wished to keep the Tudors safe as potential leverage against England should Edward contemplate reigniting the 100 Years' War in France. Therefore, Duke Francis was compelled to maintain a delicate equilibrium, holding both King Edward IV of England and King Louis XVIII of France at bay, while safeguarding his two Tudor guests. Eventually, Francis made the decision to separate the pair, sending Jasper to the Château de Josselin in the heartland of Brittany and Henry to the Château Largoët, which was originally a military stronghold in the town of Elvin. For the first time in his life, Henry, now 17, was left alone and situated far from home, without any family members within reach whom he could see and consult with. For 3 solitary years, he was effectively confined under house arrest within the chateau's highest tower, even as Edward IV continued to press for Henry's extradition to England. In 1476, the English altered their strategy. Edward IV now bypassed Duke Francis and dispatched a message directly to Henry, inviting him to return to England and proposing that a marriage to a Yorkist woman could be arranged. Edward may have been genuine in this proposal and might even have envisioned his own eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, as the potential bride. The king further promised that should Henry return at this time, he would inherit the substantial Beaufort fortune and estates in the future, currently held by his mother, Margaret. However, should Henry decline to return, Edward IV declared he would receive nothing and his exile would become permanent. On the 9th of April, 1483, the corpulent Edward IV, whose health had been deteriorating throughout the preceding year, died. He was survived by his widow, now the Dowager Queen of England, Elizabeth Woodville, and 7 children, 5 daughters, and critically from the perspective of the succession, 2 sons. His eldest son, Edward, was immediately proclaimed as King Edward V, But disagreement arose within the House of York regarding whether the boy, who was just 12 years old at the time of his father's death, was sufficiently mature to govern in his own right. His mother believed he was, and the late king's advisors concurred that Edward should be crowned without delay. Yet the boy's uncle, King Edward IV's younger brother, Richard, evidently held a different view. As the last surviving brother of Edward IV, Richard now occupied a position of considerable influence during his nephew's reign as a child king. He promptly secured his appointment as Lord Protector until Edward V reached his majority. Within mere days of their father's death, Richard had Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, apprehended and confined within the Tower of London, asserting that this was for their own safety and that a plot to usurp Edward was underway. In reality, the plotter was Richard himself, who now set about reviving the rumors that his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been illegal and that Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were therefore illegitimate. Having achieved this on the 25th of June 1483, he had Parliament declare that his deceased brother's children were illegitimate and assumed the throne himself, being crowned 2 weeks later as King Richard III. The ultimate fate of his two nephews, known to posterity as the Princes in the Tower, remains an unresolved historical mystery. Richard almost certainly orchestrated their deaths around the time he seized the throne. Up until 1483, it appeared that the Wars of the Roses had concluded and the Yorkist lineage had triumphed. Richard's actions, however, fundamentally altered the situation, as many people, including former adherents of both the Yorkist and Lancastrian causes, were repulsed by his conduct. Numerous erstwhile supporters of King Edward IV absconded to France and began establishing contact with the 26-year-old exile, Henry Tudor, who was still seeking refuge in Brittany, and his uncle Jasper. Despite the tenuous nature of his claim to the throne, Parliament having decreed nearly a century earlier that the Beaufort line would be granted legitimacy solely on the condition that its members could not succeed to the English throne, Henry Tudor now represented the best prospect for those who desired the removal of Richard III. Over the subsequent 2 years, discontented Englishmen who were dissatisfied with Richard III's rule converged on Brittany to join the burgeoning Tudor movement. Concurrently, back in England, as opposition to Richard's reign solidified, especially concerning the disappearance and presumed murder of the princes, Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, initiated clandestine negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen Dowager. She proposed that if Elizabeth Woodville offered support for Henry's cause, he would subsequently marry Elizabeth, Edward IV's eldest daughter, once he was King of England, thereby reconciling the various factions and bringing the Wars of the Roses to a close. Margaret was thus instrumental in secretly coordinating the rebellion from within England and communicated with Henry in France regarding the marriage negotiations. These efforts by Margaret in 1483 also centered around a planned uprising by her relative by marriage through her second union, Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham. In the late autumn of 1483, he launched a rebellion against Richard III, the intention being for Henry to cross over from France with his supporters to join him. Utilizing ships, men, and provisions loaned from the Duke of Brittany, Henry attempted to set sail for England but was prevented from doing so for several days by adverse weather conditions in the English Channel. Richard swiftly crushed Buckingham's rebellion and had the Duke executed. Upon learning of Henry's mother's involvement, the king also confiscated her estates and income and placed her under house arrest. Richard also immediately demanded of the Duke of Brittany that he extradite Henry Tudor back to England. In Brittany, Henry promptly made his way to the court of King Louis XIII of France, where he received a warm reception and was furnished with additional men and financial assistance, the French king being only too pleased to foment unrest in England and potentially assist Henry Tudor in seizing the English throne. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to correspond secretly with her son, keeping him abreast of developments in England. Those who had survived Buckingham's unsuccessful rebellion had joined the increasing numbers of supporters surrounding Henry in France, but although the cruelty of Richard III had rendered him unpopular, this had not altered the reality that Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was, at best, fragile, and that he remained a Lancastrian. Consequently, many Yorkists supported him reluctantly and might not continue to do so for long after Richard's removal. Aware of these concerns, on Christmas Day 1483, Henry addressed his diverse supporters at Rennes Cathedral, swearing an oath to lead them to victory against Richard III and subsequently marry Elizabeth of York as his mother and Elizabeth Woodville had planned. This action placated the Yorkists and also enhanced the legitimacy of his potential seizure of the crown by ensuring that any children Henry might father and who might one day succeed him would be the grandchildren of the deceased King Edward IV. This plan was soon nearly thwarted. In England, after his queen, Anne Neville, died in the March of 1485, rumors began to circulate at Richard III's court suggesting he intended to marry Elizabeth himself, notwithstanding the fact that she was his niece. Such a move would prevent Henry from gaining legitimacy through marriage to her. This development imparted urgency to Henry's second attempt at an invasion of England, and he finally embarked for England on the 1st of August 1485, accompanied by only a few thousand men. Comprising a small and not particularly cohesive force, Henry's army consisted of Englishmen, Welshmen, and French mercenaries. They landed discreetly in Wales, hoping to rally additional local support before confronting Richard III's forces. They anchored on the 7th of August at Mill Bay and struggled ashore. Henry succeeded in gathering additional military backing in Wales over the 2 weeks that followed, crossing the English border with approximately 5,000 troops. They encountered Richard III's considerably larger army, numbering between 10,000 and 15,000 men, at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. Richard's forces occupied the elevated position on Ambion Hill and appeared to possess all other advantages, including superior cavalry and reserves. However, the substantial forces under Lord Thomas Stanley, Henry's stepfather from his mother's fourth marriage, had not yet committed to either side, despite Richard holding Stanley's son, Lord Strange, as a hostage to secure Stanley's military support. Henry's infantry advanced first, under an intense exchange of projectiles. To minimize the impact of the barrage, they spread out across the field as they moved forward. The apparent vulnerability of these formations encouraged Richard's infantry to charge, at which point Henry's infantry reformed into a compact, wedge-shaped configuration, against which Richard's attack faltered. Richard then attempted to deploy his reserves, the men commanded by the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy. The reason for Percy's failure to charge remains unclear. Northumberland may have been waiting to observe Lord Stanley's actions. It is also possible that he and his troops were hindered from moving by the marshy terrain, but Richard, it seems, had grown too impatient to wait any longer. He had spotted Henry towards the rear of his army with a small mounted contingent. Assembling a retinue of his personal knights, Richard led a charge down the hill towards the bodyguards surrounding Henry Tudor. Richard charged boldly across the field on horseback. In the moments that ensued, he killed Henry's standard-bearer and came within a few feet of Henry himself. However, the instant of Richard's assault coincided with the moment Lord Stanley issued the command for his men to enter the battle on Henry Tudor's side. Richard and his men were immediately overwhelmed, not only by the swift reformation of Henry's infantry, but also by the cavalry charge led by Lord Thomas Stanley's brother William. Richard was surrounded, and his own troops were cut down around him. Brandishing his sword, he proclaimed his intention to die a king upon the battlefield. This is precisely what occurred. The odds against Henry had appeared nearly insurmountable, yet he had achieved what almost no one, save perhaps his mother, believed he would. He had won the throne of England. Many challenges lay ahead, however. He now faced the task of establishing and constructing a stable government into a dynasty that would endure beyond his lifetime. Only a few days thereafter, Henry VII convened his first parliament. During this session, efforts were made to seek the invalidation of Richard III's 2-year reign and to legitimize Henry's own accession. Legal arguments were presented asserting that Richard had been a usurper, while Henry was the rightful claimant after Richard had eliminated his 2 nephews, the sons of Edward IV. The Parliament also repealed the decree issued by Richard's Parliament, which had pronounced the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville illegal, and in doing so, rendered their children illegitimate. This action legitimized Henry's future bride, Elizabeth of York, and ensured that any children he might father with her would be regarded as legitimate. Finally, Henry also undertook efforts at this time to revise the historical account of his struggle for the throne. He backdated the Battle of Bosworth Field to the 21st of August 1485, when it had actually occurred on the 22nd of August. Although a minor alteration, by shifting the date back by a single day, Henry empowered himself to accuse anyone who had fought on Richard's side at Bosworth Field of treason. It served as an early indication of the kind of ruthlessness that, over time, would draw considerable criticism towards Henry VII. The action itself generated significant unease and apprehension. Yet at this initial phase, this step taken by the new king amounted to little more than a stark reminder that everyone's safety and prosperity stemmed solely from Henry's grace and favor. This tactic, however, would prove insufficient in guaranteeing domestic tranquility in England, and Henry would confront no fewer than 4 uprisings over the ensuing 12 years. Henry VII postponed fulfilling his pledge to marry Elizabeth of York until the subsequent year. They eventually exchanged vows on the 18th of January, 1486. The reason for this delay remains unclear, particularly considering that Elizabeth gave birth to their first child less than 7 months after their wedding, indicating she was already expecting when she arrived at the altar. This strongly suggests that Henry only finalized his decision to marry Elizabeth upon discovering her pregnancy, allowing him to be reasonably confident that a male heir would emerge from the union, thus securing the fledgling Tudor dynasty. Despite this rather pragmatic initial approach to the marriage, Henry and Elizabeth's union developed over time into a partnership characterized by genuine affection and mutual respect. It was not merely Elizabeth's lineage, but also her popularity among the Yorkist nobility and the English populace, combined with her devoted love for Henry and their offspring, that bolstered Henry's authority. Their marriage holds a somewhat singular place in the medieval and early modern history of England, as Henry VII is not believed to have ever engaged in extramarital affairs throughout their marriage. The union ultimately produced 7 children over a span of 17 years, 4 of whom reached a marriageable age. The subsequent 24 years of Henry VII's reign were punctuated by rebellions, challenges to his authority by rival claimants to the throne, and numerous endeavors on Henry's part to preserve and strengthen his grip on England. In April 1486, he suppressed a minor rebellion orchestrated by some Yorkist adherents, namely the 2 surviving Stafford brothers and Viscount Lovell. Later that year, on the 19th of September, the houses of York and Lancaster were truly unified with the arrival of Prince Arthur Tudor at Winchester. The birth of a male heir heralded the promise of a new era of peace in England, and Henry's choice to name his eldest son after the legendary King of Britain and Camelot was profoundly symbolic. Henry's mother-in-law, Elizabeth Woodville, served as godmother to young Arthur at his baptism. Nevertheless, just a few months thereafter, the Queen Dowager was stripped of her estates and consigned to enforced retirement at Bermondsey Abbey. The precise reasons behind Henry VII's treatment of his mother-in-law in this manner are not entirely clear, but the cause likely stemmed from his own mother, Margaret Beaufort, who perceived Woodville as a rival within the court and resented having to yield precedence to her as a former queen consort. This entire situation underscored the precariousness of the supposed reconciliation between the Yorkists and Lancastrians under Henry's rule, and how trivial personal interests could jeopardize all of Henry's efforts. A new and more alarming rebellion against Henry's rule commenced in 1487. That year, John de la Pole, the Yorkist Earl of Lincoln, instigated an uprising in support of a peasant boy named Lambert Simnel. Lincoln and his followers now asserted that this boy was in fact the young Earl of Warwick, a nephew of Edward IV, whom they intended to install on the throne. Simnel was clearly a mere figurehead chosen because he bore a superficial likeness to Warwick, the latter of whom was, in reality, still confined within the Tower of London. Despite this, the schemers surrounding Simnel amassed a considerable following in Ireland, which was partially under the control of the English crown. Simnel was crowned as King Edward VI of England in a makeshift ceremony conducted in Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. Despite these ostensibly promising beginnings, when Simnel and his followers crossed to England, Henry swiftly crushed their rebellion on the 16th of June 1487 at the Battle of Stoke, during which the Earl of Lincoln lost his life. Subsequently, Henry displayed clemency towards the rebels, pardoning most of them, including Simnel, whom he brought to his court and assigned work in the kitchens. Simnel would live until at least the 1530s and later secured a position as a royal falconer. Henry demonstrated that he could be both ruthless and merciful as a monarch. In the same year, Henry commissioned the creation of a new royal crown to serve as a symbol of the nascent monarchy. This crown was adorned with elaborate jewels and incorporated the royal symbols of both England and France. The latter claim to rule the kings of England continued to press long after the 100 Years' War had concluded. Other innovations introduced by Henry include the first minting of a gold sovereign coin, equivalent to £1. Other medieval coins typically featured an image of the monarch on one side and a cross on the other. Henry's gold sovereign, however, instead displayed the Tudor rose. This emblem combined the white and red roses of the houses of York and Lancaster and served as a potent declaration to the realm that Henry had unified the warring factions and brought the civil conflict to an end. He also invested heavily in architectural projects and ornamentation to bolster his authority, constructing the impressive Richmond Palace on the banks of the River Thames near London. This structure was erected around 1500 and would remain one of the foremost royal residences in England for a century and a half before being largely destroyed during the English Civil War in the mid-17th century. King Henry and Queen Elizabeth's family continued to expand throughout the first decade of their marriage. On the 28th of November 1489, Elizabeth gave birth to their second child and eldest daughter, whom they named Margaret in honor of Henry's mother. 2 years later, on the 28th of June 1491, their second son, named Prince Henry after his father, was born. Their fourth child, another daughter, arrived in July 1492 and was named Elizabeth after her mother, but she survived for only 3 years, a reflection of the high rates of infant mortality prevalent at the time. 4 years after the birth of the ill-fated Elizabeth, on the 18th of March 1496, Elizabeth delivered her last child who would survive into adulthood, Mary. While Henry VII was generally known as a cordial, yet nonetheless serious, prudent, and reserved individual, he relaxed considerably in the company of his wife and children, and reportedly encouraged and cherished his close family life. In the 1490s, Henry was compelled to address renewed unrest originating once more from Ireland, as news reached England that a young man who had spent time there, known as Perkin Warbeck, was claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger son of King Edward IV. In truth, Warbeck was another impostor. His origins are veiled in uncertainty, although most historians agree that he likely originated from the Low Countries and had been brought to prominence there by the Countess of Burgundy, a sister of the deceased King Edward IV, on account of his likeness to Richard. These assertions were troubling. Henry's claim to the throne was based on the premise that Edward IV's sons had been killed by Richard III, and that he, as a result, possessed the strongest claim. Moreover, unlike Lambert Simnel before him, Warbeck remained at large for several years and garnered influential support in Scotland and on the continent, as well as in Ireland. He was also an active rebel, in contrast to the more passive Simnel. To counter this threat, as Warbeck prepared to invade England, Henry imposed new taxes within England. These in turn ignited resentment and rebellion in Cornwall, culminating in a widespread uprising across southern England in the summer of 1497. It was only suppressed following military engagements near London itself, and Henry's wife and children were forced to seek safety within the Tower of London at the height of the crisis. On the 17th of June 1497, Henry VII defeated the Cornish rebels at the Battle of Blackheath, also referred to as the Battles of Deptford Bridge. 4 months later, on the 5th of October, the man purporting to be Richard, Duke of York, Perkin Warbeck, was finally apprehended in Hampshire and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Following extensive interrogation, he ultimately signed a comprehensive confession stating that his claim to the English throne had been false and that his true identity was indeed Perkin Warbeck, a common Flemish man hailing from the town of Tournai in what is now Belgium. This confession allowed Henry to broadcast to the realm that this individual was not the returned son of Edward IV. After a failed attempt to escape from the tower in November 1499, Warbeck was executed, bringing an end to a 4-year episode that ultimately cost Henry over $13,000, an enormous sum in the late 15th century, and simultaneously generated immense instability throughout the kingdom. Following the Warbeck crisis, Henry began adopting more calculated approaches to solidify his authority, specifically by employing a cadre of ruthless administrators who would establish a network of covert operatives to monitor the political landscape of the English court in the towns and also to implement a more absolutist form of governance aimed at extracting as much revenue as possible from the country. Through these means, Henry would develop a more efficient system of rule and secure the Tudor dynasty against all adversaries. This represented royal absolutism more than a century before its definitive emergence in France. Initially, Henry retained the services of the highly learned former Chief Justice, Sir John Fortescue, who distinguished himself as one of England's pioneering political and constitutional analysts. He authored a profoundly influential treatise on statecraft, often simply known as the Governance of England, but whose original title was The Difference Between an Absolute and a Limited Monarchy. Fortescue had spent his life observing the distinctions between English governance and that of France, and had concluded that the crucial difference lay in the English king's inability to impose taxes without the consent of Parliament. The French king possessed the power to levy taxes upon his people whenever he desired, thereby amassing wealth and power. The common people of England, conversely, enjoyed greater prosperity and had imposed constraints on the English crown's capacity to raise taxes. This, Fortescue asserted, had been the primary catalyst for the devastating Wars of the Roses. If Henry wished to strengthen his position, he needed to overcome this obstacle and enrich himself through alternative means. The solution, he believed, involved the king acquiring new lands and annual revenues, thereby diminishing the authority Parliament and the aristocracy held over him. Fortescue's analysis ushered in a period of absolutist governance during the final decade of Henry's reign. He significantly curtailed the size and scope of the court and drastically reduced the number of individuals who had access to the center of power, thereby considerably lowering the cost of government and conserving significant funds. The result of this was that Henry now began to govern with only a small, select group of loyal followers. Henry also bolstered his network of spies and commenced acquiring more lands and revenues by pressuring his nobles to divest their property to him whenever possible. His administrators assumed direct control of England's finances, meticulously managing the collection of taxes and other matters that had traditionally been entrusted to local lords and elites for oversight. All of these actions were deeply resented by the political class. Yet there was also no denying their effectiveness. Over the last 12 years of his reign, the crown achieved financial self-sufficiency, and between 1497 and 1509, Henry was required to convene only one brief parliament, which met in the spring of 1504. Another frequently overlooked aspect of Henry's policies during these years was his stance regarding Ireland. The English crown had conquered a significant portion of the neighboring island in the 12th and 13th centuries, only to see an Irish resurgence push them back to Dublin and its surrounding territory in the 14th and 15th centuries. Furthermore, not only was English authority there diminished, but the support both Simnel and Warbeck had garnered on the island demonstrated that even the lords of English descent in Ireland had become a liability to the English crown. Henry initiated a more assertive interventionist strategy, dispatching Sir Edward Poynings to Ireland in 1494. Over the subsequent several years, Poynings introduced several significant reforms and presided over a parliament, notably enacting Poynings Law, a legal instrument that mandated that any legislation intended for passage through an Irish parliament must first be reviewed by the government in England. This would have constitutional ramifications for Ireland for the next 300 years. Henry also solicited opinions regarding leading an army to Ireland to undertake a military conquest of the rebellious English lords and the native Irish chieftains there, though he ultimately concluded this would be too costly and continued to permit the powerful Earls of Kildare to manage the Dublin administration on his behalf. These years also witnessed Henry's efforts to forge a powerful alliance with the two unified kingdoms of Spain, Aragon, and Castile by arranging the marriage of his eldest son and heir, Prince Arthur, to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. On the 12th of November 1501, the populace of London cheered as the 16-year-old Catherine passed through the city en route to the palace at Westminster. 2 days later, on the 14th of November, Arthur and Catherine were married in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, departing after a further 10 days of celebratory feasts, tournaments, and entertainments for Ludlow Castle and their marital life in the Welsh Marches. Having secured such a prestigious marriage for his eldest son and heir, which came accompanied by a very substantial dowry, Henry's dynastic future appeared assured. However, less than 6 months later, calamity struck. The death of Elizabeth of York triggered a widespread outpouring of grief across the entire realm of England. She had been greatly cherished by the populace, and her very presence had moderated the harsher aspects of Henry's inclination towards autocratic rule. Her funeral procession and ceremony ranked among the most lavish and costly events staged during the characteristically frugal reign of Henry VII, costing over $3,000. Henry experienced an emotional breakdown around this time. Despite a difficult and initially distrustful beginning, his marriage had become the cornerstone of his reign, and the family he and Elizabeth had created together had softened the more severe facets of his personality. Following Elizabeth's death, Henry withdrew into seclusion for days, refusing to receive visitors or speak to anyone. When he finally re-emerged, many observed a discernible, harder edge to him, and he became more severe and autocratic in his governing approach. Despite his sorrow, Henry was compelled to make new arrangements for the succession. He took a particular interest in the education of his remaining son, Prince Henry. Their relationship proved challenging. The king was a demanding disciplinarian, and his frequent criticisms of Prince Henry may well have contributed to psychological difficulties that would, in turn, lead to the future King Henry VIII. Also around this time, with a noticeable absence of overt emotion, Henry orchestrated the marriage of his 13-year-old daughter Margaret to King James IV of Scotland, a mere 6 months after his wife's death. The position of Princess Catherine of Aragon also presented a concern. Following Arthur's death, the King and Queen of Spain had begun demanding the return of Princess Catherine's dowry, a substantial sum of money that Henry was desperately unwilling to relinquish. After the passing of his own wife, he contemplated marrying Catherine himself, but soon concluded that the most suitable resolution would be for Prince Henry to marry Catherine. To this end, he sought a papal dispensation for the betrothal of Catherine to Henry on the likely unfounded basis that Catherine and Arthur had not consummated their marriage. The negotiations with Rome and with Catherine's parents in Spain would span many years, and ultimately, Henry and Catherine would not marry until 1509, at which time lingering legal questions surrounding the marriage persisted, issues that would be revived 2 decades later with profound consequences for English political and religious history. In the autumn of 1503, Henry enlisted an experienced London lawyer named Edmund Dudley to aid him in his unscrupulous revenue-generating activities. Under Dudley's oversight, the Crown's fiscal policies became even more objectionable. Not content with simply pressuring landowners to sell their estates and surrender their annual revenues, Henry now directed Dudley to transform the Privy Chamber and the Royal Treasury, traditional organs of royal administration, into overtly business-like operations. For example, Dudley revived laws that had long fallen into disuse in England in order to impose fines on individuals who committed minor offenses. If anyone declined to pay the resulting fines or protested their perceived injustice, they were incarcerated. Many, understandably, opted to pay the penalties. Henry also commenced levying fines against his nobles for maintaining private armies. Notwithstanding the fact that this had been standard practice in medieval England, though this also served as a security measure intended to prevent any figure like Warwick the Kingmaker from decades past from instigating new conflicts against the crown. Other legal interventions added to the growing resentment directed towards Henry VII and his closest advisors, such as Fortescue and Dudley. For instance, in the later years of his reign, Henry assembled a small group of carefully selected lawyers to serve as his, quote, counsel learned in the law. This body lacked official statutory authority. Instead, it worked directly for Henry, intervening in various legal proceedings within the formal courts and privately deciding matters themselves. Frequently, this was done with the aim of imposing fines that were paid directly into the royal treasury. This created enormous public discontent, as such interventions were viewed as a violation of the relationship between the English crown and its subjects that had been established through various legal instruments over several centuries, such as the Magna Carta of the 13th century. As a testament to how unpopular figures like Dudley were perceived as instruments of Henry VII's absolutist policies, when Henry VIII ascended to the throne a few years later, Dudley was swiftly apprehended, charged with treason, and executed. By 1507, it was evident that the most popular figure in England was Prince Henry. His father, the king, was pleased to showcase his son's capabilities and assigned him the task of organizing and staging the spring tournaments that year. The 15-year-old Henry genuinely excelled during the ceremonies and events, presiding over the tournaments, greeting dignitaries, engaging in conversation with both noblemen and commoners, with affability and charm, and gracefully presenting the tournament's victors with valuable tokens. Henry VII had only reached his 50th birthday in January 1507. Nevertheless, portraits painted of him in the mid-1500s reveal the toll his life and position had taken. His prominent features, high cheekbones, nose, and cleft chin, appeared even more pronounced. His increasingly gaunt, pale countenance, marked by deep lines across his forehead and along the sides of his nose and the sunken areas beneath his seemingly cold blue eyes, narrated the story of a man whose early life had held great promise, but whose constant companions in the subsequent years had been worry, mistrust, disappointment, personal loss, ill health, and sorrow. His physical condition was also deteriorating, and he was suffering from what is presumed to have been tuberculosis. In January 1509, his health worsened, and he withdrew from court into isolation at Richmond Palace. Finally, on the 21st of April 1509, Henry VII, King of England, died. He was just 52 years old at the time and had reigned over England for 24 years. For 2 days, his death was concealed from everyone except those who had been present at his bedside, as arrangements were made to ensure a seamless succession without the risk of rebellion. Henry's counselors were determined to prevent a new civil war, and every necessary measure was taken to ensure King Henry VIII was securely established on the throne before public announcements of the old king's death were made. By the time he passed away, Henry VII was widely resented by both the English public and the political class comprising nobles, courtiers, local officials, and magistrates. He seemed to be little mourned by most of the court, with the notable exceptions of his mother and some of his closest advisors. Margaret Beaufort had remained her son's nearest and most trusted ally to his final moments, and her affection and support for her son had never wavered. It was Margaret who took swift action to secure the accession of her grandson, Prince Henry, temporarily setting aside her grief for her son until the succession was confirmed. It was she who organized her son's funeral and her grandson's coronation, even advising the young King Henry VIII on appointments to his Privy Council. Henry followed her every recommendation, though she herself would not live much longer. The day after her grandson's 18th birthday, on the 29th of June 1509, less than 2 months after her own son's death, Margaret Beaufort followed Henry VII to the grave. Henry was buried next to his wife in the chapel he had commissioned and adorned with his family's symbols within Westminster Abbey, their effigies lying in peaceful repose, their hands clasped in prayer. Margaret Beaufort was interred in her own impressive tomb, located only a few feet from those of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth. The reign that commenced thereafter began with considerable promise, but devolved into even greater instability than anything Henry VII had overseen. Henry VIII was not a figure preoccupied with balancing the royal accounts or pursuing cautious policies. Instead, he became fixated on resuming the conflict that King Edward III had initiated back in the 1330s to reassert England's claims to territories in France. He engaged in military conflict with the French on 3 separate occasions, effectively bankrupting the English state in the process and achieving virtually nothing beyond securing the town of Boulogne in northern France for a few years before it was rapidly lost to the French once more. He is considerably better known for his matrimonial entanglements. When his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which was otherwise the most successful of his 6 marriages, failed to produce a male heir, he became determined to divorce her on the grounds that his brother Arthur had, in fact, consummated his marriage to Catherine back in 1501, and consequently Henry could not legally marry his brother's widow. The papacy in Spain proved reluctant to accede to Henry's belated assertion of fraternal conscience, setting in motion a sequence of events that would see the Church of England separate from the Roman Catholic fold and the Protestant Reformation commence in England. Henry would marry 5 more times within a span of less than a decade, with his 3rd marriage eventually producing a male heir, the future King Edward VI. Underlying all these actions was a pervasive obsession with ensuring the succession. In this regard, Henry was very much his father's son, and Henry VII's counsel to his son to remember the civil wars of the 15th century heavily influenced many of his actions decades later. Henry VII is frequently portrayed as a somewhat tyrannical ruler. This assessment is not entirely equitable. While he did indeed evolve into a form of absolutist monarch in the 1500s and appeared progressively less concerned with how the English populace and the political establishment perceived his actions, those same actions were inherently logical and must be understood in the context of how he attained the throne. Henry Tudor became King of England due to an improbable series of events in which psychologically unstable kings and murderous uncles had collectively facilitated the rise of a Welsh outsider, whose lineage was legally barred from inheriting the throne, to become King Henry VII in 1485. Thereafter, he faced one rebellion after another in the late 1480s and throughout the 1490s. What is your assessment of Henry VII? Do you consider him an unnecessarily autocratic monarch, or were his actions understandable given the political crises that had afflicted England for decades throughout the 15th century?